Hi, this lecture is based on a PowerPoint presentation, and we obviously don't have the PowerPoint presentation right here. However, I've made handouts of the PowerPoint slides, and if you go to the online reading section of Blackboard, you can find the First Century Judaisms handout, and it's got a number of slides that we'll be referring to during this lecture. This overlaps a little bit with the Airman textbook reading that you did for today, but some of it is in addition or separate from the reading. I'm going to give you some information that he doesn't give you, but which I think is pretty important. So if you'll please pull up that handout and look, this is going to be on First Century Judaisms and the Jesus movement. It's going to give you specifically some social and political background of what was going on in Palestine or Israel around the first century that can be relevant for understanding the Jesus movement. We're going to back up and start prior to the first century. If you'll look, the first slide says, "Who controls Israel?" Now, what this is about, right, is that Israel is, or was, in the ancient world, a state that was ruled by kings temporarily. And if you look, Jews were conquered by the Babylonians. This is centuries, 5 or 7 or 8 centuries before the first century. So this is like 7 centuries BCE, something like that. The Jews are conquered by Babylonians and they're sent into exile. The Babylonians more or less kicked them out of the land. The Persians defeated the Babylonians, and they permitted the Jews to return to Palestine and rebuild the temple. Now what happened when the Babylonians conquered Israel, they tore down the temple. That was called the first temple, because when the Persians helped the Jews build a second one, they called that the second temple. So this period is sometimes referred to as Second Temple Judaism because it's during the time when the Second Temple existed. The Second Temple, again, the one that was helped, the one that the Persians helped the Jews build. The Persians rule Israel, or rule over Israel for a while, and then the Greeks conquer the Persians. So the Greeks are in charge of Palestine. Then, it says here, the Greeks conquer the Persians and Israel was under oppressive Greek rule. There are lots of stories in history about the things that the Greeks were doing to the Israelites that were pretty dastardly, so to speak. Some of the rulers over Palestine, the Greek rulers, were pretty mean, and of course the Israel didn't like that. They wanted to rule themselves rather than be ruled by an outsider, and as such they started what became known as the Maccabean Revolt. These two brothers, the Maccabean brothers, they're from the Maccabean family, decided to launch a revolt. And I mean, it's like what you think a revolt would be: some guys with, sticks and swords and stuff like that are building a rebellion up in the hills, and then they come down out of the hills every once in a while to attack the Greeks. Obviously, it's more complicated than that, but they started a small rebellion, and they were successful in overthrowing Greek rule after a war that lasted for many years. Now, if you go down the next slide, Who Controls Israel Part 2, there is a Maccabean kingdom established. There was a Maccabean kingdom established, for about 80 years. It was about 142 BCE to 63 BCE. So what we have is a time period where the Jews were ruled in Palestine for centuries. First by the Babylonians, then by the Persians, then by the Greeks, and through this act of rebellion they were able to overthrow the Greeks and establish what became called the Maccabean kingdom. Now what was unique about this, right, is that instead of being ruled by foreigners, they had their own king, an Israelite king who ruled them from, hopefully with an Israelite ideology or from an Israelite perspective. They were ruled by their own kings. However, there became some conflict and the Romans moved in. You can see the second bullet point here. The Romans retake control of Palestine in 63 BCE. So this Maccabean kingdom only lasted for about 80 years, and then the Romans took over. I mean, what we have is a time period of centuries where the Jews are ruled by foreign nations, only 80 years of which during this time period are they ruling themselves. So it's almost entirely foreign rule. The Romans maintained control throughout the New Testament period. Something of note, if you see the last bullet point on that slide, the Romans destroyed the second temple, right? The first one was built long ago. It was destroyed by the Babylonians, the Persians helped the Jews to rebuild it, and that was the second temple. The second temple was destroyed by the Romans when a war broke out between the Romans and the Jews in 70 CE. That's called the Roman-Jewish War, the Jewish War against Rome, something like that. So the Second Temple period ends, of course, with the destruction of the Second Temple. Now, look to the next slide. Expectations. In this sort of social and political context, what were people expecting or hoping for? Well, in part, they were hoping for a Messiah. Now, what does this mean? What does the word Messiah mean? Now, if you look, the first line here, Davidic or Maccabean Messiah. Now, just so you know, Messiah simply literally means anointed one. It technically means anointed one. And what anointed one means is, for instance, in the Hebrew Bible or the Tanakh or the Old Testament, when God would want to appoint someone to be king, he would possibly do something like this: send a prophet to anoint an individual to become king. So there's a story about King David, who is probably the most famous king in the Jewish history. He stands out among all the others in the history as being the #1 Jewish king. Before he was king, God sends a prophet to anoint David, and presumably this involves something like rubbing a little bit of oil on his head. That would be an anointing. Once he was anointed, then later on, of course, that was the sign from God that this is my chosen one to be the next king. And of course, David, rose to kingship after that. Messiah simply literally means anointed one. Now, the word Christ is the same as the word for Messiah. Messiah is the Hebrew word, Christ is the Greek word. So both Messiah and Christ literally mean anointed one, just that one is the Hebrew term, the other is the Greek term. Now, when I say they were hoping for a Davidic or Maccabean Messiah, I mean what that means is that they wanted a king. They wanted a king like David or like the Maccabean kingdom. They were sick of being ruled by the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans. They wanted their own king like they had back when they had David or back when they had the Maccabean kingdom. Now remember, the Maccabean kingdom ended in 63 BCE, so this was only about 60 or 70 years back when they actually had their own Messiah or their own Christ in charge of their nation in the sense of a kingship. They were sick of the Roman rule and they wanted another king, another Messiah, another Christ, just like they had when they had David or the Maccabean kingdom.